The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Proof of vaccination is now required in Ontario for many indoor activities. Tonight, how does it work? And will it keep the fourth wave in check this fall? Then we'll hear from our Northeastern Ontario Hub with some takeaways from evacuations caused by this summer's wildfires. And from labor shortages to final thoughts on the election, we've got the Agenda's Weekend Review. It's Friday, September 24th, and that's next on the Agenda. While Ontario hasn't led the way in Canada on vaccine passports, this week the first stage of implementing them went into effect here. What does that mean for your trip to the gym or a restaurant? And how far will it go to putting COVID-19 behind us? Let's ask. In the nation's capital, Raywa Dionandan, epidemiologist and associate professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Ottawa. And in Hamilton, Ontario, Dr. Martha Fulford, Associate Professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases at McMaster University. Welcome back to you both.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start by showing exactly where Ontarians need to show proof of vaccination along with a government-issued form of identification, mostly indoors. If you're thinking about going to concerts, theaters, or cinemas, you will need one. Restaurants or nightclubs, horse racing and car racing tracks, commercial TV and film productions with audiences, water parks, spectator sports, casinos and bingo halls, fitness facilities like the gym, banquet halls, and convention centers. There are a few exemptions for children under 12, use of an indoor bathroom, if you're going into a restaurant to pay and pick up your order to eat out, or if you're going into the grocery store or pharmacies. Raywa, I wanted to start with you. What is your basic view on vaccine passports?
Oh, simple question. Well, I support them, but limitedly and with concern. I'm a brown guy, immigrant to this country, so the idea of being asked for my documents to access services or facilities does not fill me with a great amount of comfort. However, this is going to be a risk-benefit analysis at any given time. So the risk of this being a slow tread towards the tyranny of government must be balanced against the benefit of this tool increasing vaccine uptake and some other good things in getting us out of the pandemic faster. So I think overall, I support it as a tool for accelerating vaccine uptake in particular. So I think it's one of many tools that must be used in a panoply of a diversity of public health tools. In and of itself, it will not save the day. It's one very important tool.
We have seen an uptick on people registering to get their first dose or getting their second dose. So Raywa, why do you think that is, that more people are, or why do you think that that's a way to maybe convince people to get vaccinated?
Well, who are the unvaccinated? They're a diverse, heterogeneous group. They include the hardcore anti-vaxxers, and we have to deal with them in a different way. They include the vaccine hesitant, who just need a good conversation and access to an authoritative voice to walk them through the data. They include people who need and want vaccination but can't get access due to policy constraints. They can't get childcare or time off work. Then there are the apathetic. The apathetic tend to be younger, have a lot of confidence in their innate immune systems, and don't see a reason or an incentive yet to seek vaccination. The vaccine passport is good for targeting that apathetic group. Suddenly, there's an incentive, there's a reason to seek vaccination. So that is where the growth in uptake will be. It won't be across the board for all unvaccinated people, just a particular segment.
And Martha, what is your view on vaccine passports?
I actually agree with a lot of what Raywa just said. One of the questions when we put in a public health measure like this is, what actually is our objective? How are we going to monitor it? I haven't seen that from public health yet. As what are we aiming for? How are we going to monitor it? How are we going to evaluate it? Because really what we want, of course, is to ensure that we target the actual networks of transmission, decrease the disease burden in our hospitals. And so there's always a chance with this that it may or may not result in an uptick in, the apathetic's a good term, actually. I hadn't heard it, but it's a great term. But if it doesn't, it result in an uptick in the really vulnerable adults who are already our marginalized populations, then we may end up with a lot of inadvertent consequences. We may end up with increased transmission because we're further marginalizing people already marginalized who are now going to congregate in even less safe settings.
How would that work? I just want to follow up on that. How would that work? How would we end up with more cases?
Well, because if we actually further polarize people, so we have all the unvaccinated now sort of congregating together, we may actually end up with increased transmission because they're even further pushed away from a lot of public health measures. And ironically, the vaccinated may end up with a false sense of security because we know that being vaccinated is a personal choice. It decreases my risk of severe disease. But shedding of the virus can happen from either unvaccinated or vaccinated people, albeit less when you're vaccinated. But we may end up with a false sense of security in the vaccinated people thinking they don't have to worry. And so there's a possible inadvertent consequence. And we just have to be aware that this is a possibility, and there have to be measures in place to monitor it. I worry about further polarization. We've already seen this. These are divisive, somewhat coercive policies. It's an unusual public health measure. And if we further polarize people and have even more antagonistic response to it, we may end up with the fence sitters even further away. And so it's important that if we're going to do this, that we have clear parameters on how we're going to measure it, that we have actually an endpoint. What is our endpoint? What are we aiming to do? And how are we going to get out of it? And it's not that it's necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just, I think we have to, if we're doing it, we have to have a really clear stated objective. This is what our endpoint is. This is how we're going to monitor it. And these are all the inadvertent consequences that we're going to take account for. And honestly, if it's not working, then we need to be honest enough to say, guess what? It didn't work. We tried. And let's look at what else we can do. Remembering that this is a public health objective. And the public health objective is to minimize the amount of virus circulating in our community and hopefully, ideally, decrease the disease impact and the people in our hospitals. Because the cases in the community are not really what we're worried about. It's the burden on the healthcare system and the severity of illness that we need to worry about.
I have a few follow-ups with what you've just said. You called it an unusual public measure. We are living in unprecedented times. I don't need to tell you that you were at the front lines of this. So a lot of people who have been vaccinated weighed the risk. And I don't know if it was a very easy, because I'm guessing people are listening and watching this. It might not have been an easy decision for them to get vaccinated, but they did so because they were trying to keep their families safe, their children safe, their communities safe. If we don't do something like this because of these unprecedented times, how else can we ensure that we don't go into another lockdown and more businesses suffer? And
And so remember, this isn't a question of trying to increase vaccine rates, it's whether this strategy will work. So in Hamilton, for example,
but it's shown an uptick of people getting vaccines.
But will it result in a decrease in hospitalizations? And that's what I'm saying about how we're going to monitor if it's working. Because if it's all the 20-year-olds who are vaccinated, this is great because it overall will have a decreased, transmission. But that's not the population that lands in hospital and stresses the system. And so in Hamilton, for example, the people who aren't vaccinated, it's not hard to find. We look at our postal codes and we see where the highest proportion of vaccinated people are, and it's in what we call our code red postal zones. These are where we have our most marginalized, our most racialized, our most discriminated against groups. It's where we have a lot of homeless, a very large group of people. I don't think the passports are going to help that group at all. It may just further marginalize them. And so that's why I'm just saying it's very nuanced, the conversation.
Ray Watt, Martha brought up some great points, because if you are if you're unhoused, you might not have ID, and you do need ID along with the vaccine proof to get into these places. We're also seeing people who have been vaccinated get COVID. And I'm guessing for the people who haven't been vaccinated for whatever reason, if they're seeing that people who are vaccinated are still getting COVID, is this a communications issue that we're, or like what's the gap?
It's a huge communications issue, of course. Pandemics have a way of exacerbating the gaps between people, exacerbating the gaps between rich and poor, uneducated and educated, black, white, etc. And policy directives can also do so as well. So Martha is correct. We need to do this carefully and sensitively and deploy a variety of tools to address the possibility of a negative consequence of these policies. We can do these things. And in particular, we need a strong educational component. And as you mentioned, an educational component that includes the limitations and the powers of vaccination, explaining that, yes, vaccinated people can still get the disease and transmit it, but to a much lesser extent. So there's a huge impetus and advantage of getting vaccinated. And I also want to follow up on something Martha just said about what is the ultimate goal here. I agree. We've done an atrocious job of expressing what the goal of this program is. And I would say there are three goals. First is to increase vaccine uptake. The second is to keep the susceptible out of super spreading environments. And the third is to keep businesses open by having them not be the home of super spreading environments. But there are a number of ultimate outcome indicators to look at as well. Hospitalization and healthcare utilization rates are just one. The other is overall population immunity. And we can't take our eye off that goal either, because down the road, when we're talking about whether or not this disease becomes endemic and what level of endemicity we want to accept, getting as much vaccination as possible into the community, even amongst 20-year-olds who are less likely to be hospitalized, is important to keep overall transmission rates as low as possible so that we can live, I hate saying this phrase, live with the disease in a more comfortable way. So there's a lot going on here. We need to have a more strategic and comprehensive set of policy indicators at play. But we've started that process.
Martha, could one argue that vaccine passports are short-term pain for long-term gain?
Yes, if they work. I wonder if maybe in Canada we might have done better using the European system of what they call a COVID certificate, if we're going to do this, where it was a slightly more comprehensive strategy, where it was proof of vaccination, a negative test within the last 72 hours, or proof of recovery. And so I think we're all aiming for the same endpoint, which is to as Raybould said, this will become an endemic virus, and we will learn to live with it as we have with other respiratory viruses. And it's really the tools we use and how to get there. I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned internationally on what has worked and what maybe has ended up polarizing and being a lot more divisive. And I would hope that we would have an open mind. You know, in North America, certainly in Ontario and Canada, we've pretty much insisted on just the vaccination route. I think we could learn from Europe in terms of what worked in places like Denmark or Norway, who have already decided, or who have already essentially said we are now in the endemic phase and have removed all restrictions. And that's where, again, as Raybould says, knowing our endpoint, our goals is really important, and understanding what's an acceptable level. The UK has got, lessons learned and maybe lessons that we would like to avoid. So I think being a little bit more open-minded. So a conversation I had with somebody yesterday, for example, some of the vaccine hesitancy is against mRNA vaccines, whether correct or wrong. I mean, I personally had no concern to be vaccinated, but maybe why aren't we offering them other options? I mean, maybe we need to meet in the middle instead of sort of becoming polarized on both sides, so that the pro-vaccine are really polarized and the anti-vaccine are really, but maybe what we should be doing is saying, all right, let's get in the Johnson & Johnson. Let's actually just stop trying to have these arguments. And in the end, what we want to do is minimize the amount of virus circulating, give people even more options, and instead of sort of ending up with almost no-win situations in some cases. So I guess I agree that this is one tool of many. We have to be very, very cautious that we track for possible inadvertent consequences, that we actually don't make the situation worse. The idea that the unvaccinated are they're not just one homogenous group of bad people. Raybould is spot on when he talks about that. This is a very diverse group of people. We can't just demonize people like that. That's a terrible thing to do. And so meeting people where they are, talking their language, taking the vaccine clinics to where that person is, maybe just giving them options, even if it grates against me as an infectious disease physician, I'm thinking just take the first vaccine you're you're offered, maybe I should suck it up and say, okay, let's just give this person an option, because the best end result is to get that person vaccinated and not get into a big argument about one or another vaccine. So I guess I'm advocating for a little bit of a more gentle and kinder approach.
You mentioned solutions too, and some of the things that have worked internationally and some things that haven't worked. We've been hearing a lot of comparison to that yellow card that we had as children. I have the yellow card from my kids in school, and I have another one from when I travel, which has yellow fever and some other vaccines. Do you think there is an issue with naming this like a vaccine passport rather than maybe an immunity card or something else to that, similar to that?
There might be. A passport suggests you're crossing a border and subject to the inspection of steely-eyed security agents who look you up and down and may deny you access. So there's something authoritarian about it. Maybe an access card. This is a marketing question. A larger question is this unprecedented in terms of our desire to restrict the movements of people based upon their risk status? I've heard that criticism a lot. I don't think it is. If we go back in time, back to 1890, when we had the third great plague pandemic, and we had a vaccine for the plague back then, and the British government decided to enact a vaccine passport for domestic movement and access in India. The unvaccinated were not permitted to access certain areas. So this goes back hundreds of years. And we have other elements in society where we have done this in the interest of public safety and health. The smoking ban is an example of restricting access based upon risk of behavior in this case, not risk of status. So we have a large precedent for this. But talking about it in terms of a passport may not be ideal. An immunity pass is one way to look at it. I think, okay, let's back up for a second. One of the issues here, is this a carrot or a stick? Some people are saying it's a stick. I don't think it is a stick. It's an additional carrot. If you take this, you now have access to all these services in society. It's an access tool, not a prohibition tool.
Well, right now, I think we are expecting businesses to be the gatekeepers of this process. Raybould, is that fair?
No, I don't think it is. I think businesses need to be supported by government. You don't have the part-time college kid at the door holding back people who might be acting boorish because they feel this is an insult to their civil liberties. It's a lot to ask for someone making minimum wage to put their body at work here at risk. So I think it needs to be supported by bylaw officers. There's a lot of work to be done by government.
And Martha, at the beginning of the pandemic, we did hear about herd immunity. Are vaccine passports enough to achieve the objective of reaching herd immunity?
One of the things we're learning, we've learned very well, for example, is I think last year we weren't sure to what degree a person who had COVID would actually have sustained antibodies, what was so-called natural immunity. We have to be very careful. We talk about natural immunity. This isn't advocating a free-for-all. But people who have recovered from COVID, in fact, do have immunity. And this is becoming eminently clear. There's some very good studies on this. And certainly the data out of Israel supports this very strongly, that people who'd had COVID and recovered were actually less likely to have breakthrough infections. And so maybe when we talk about immunity, we also need to acknowledge that while our desire is to prevent all as much severe disease as possible, clearly, and I would prefer somebody not get sick, but that the person who's had COVID and recovered need to be included in immunity. And this is part of herd immunity. It's a biologic term. It's nothing to do with COVID. And immunity has always been either recovery from infection or proof of vaccination for most infections. And, I appreciate that a year ago we weren't really sure, but we have a lot more data now. We have a lot more information on this. And again, maybe we could learn from Europe in terms of the idea of the COVID certificate or the immunity passport, that proof of recovery actually is considered an immunity. So again, it's this, maybe we need to sort of look at what's happening internationally, because in the end, that's what we want. And herd immunity isn't that the virus disappears. Herd immunity is that severe disease is at very low and manageable levels. And this is, again, I think I worry a little bit about the communication, because we haven't been very good about communicating that the personal decision to vaccinate means I'm no longer at risk of severe disease when I get exposed. And it doesn't matter if I'm exposed by a vaccine or not, I'm a vaccinated person. Herd immunity means that even though we have circulating virus, is at a very low levels. It's manageable, and when people get exposed, their immune system essentially protects them.
And Ray
So
Watt,
that
we've
is
only
the
got 30
ultimate goal.
seconds. I've only got 30 seconds, Ray Watt. Did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, it's important for us not to overestimate or underestimate the power of vaccines. It's true that they do not prevent against serious disease, but they do prevent against some transmission to a high extent. So if everyone were vaccinated, we wouldn't be in a situation of crisis at the moment. We'd have limited transmission and some percolating disease. And as to Martha's point, natural immunity must be considered in this conversation. Delta comes in like a tropical storm and leaves in its wake havoc, suffering, death, but also immunity. So wait for it.
And that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you so much for walking us through this, because it's been so confusing, and we really do appreciate your insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hundreds of wildfires burning across northern Ontario this summer meant thousands of people were evacuated from their homes. Nick Dunne covers the Northeastern Ontario Hubs. He's been looking into what it revealed about this province's emergency management capacity and joins us now from Sudbury for more. Hey, Nick.
Hi, Jan.
So we've heard about forest fires across Canada and the US. A lot of people will think about British Columbia, but of course there have been fires affecting towns and cities here in Ontario as well. And you were following one in Deer Lake, First Nations. What has it been like for them there?
It was quite a stressful situation. They hadn't received hardly any rain in months. It was getting drier. The lake water levels were dropping. And around early July is when they started to see ashes flying into the community, meaning that wind was blowing the fire closer. By July 1st, Red Lake 51 fire was about 6 square kilometers. By July 11th, when the community began their evacuation process, it was looking closer to 260 square kilometers in size and heading very close to the community. In fact, nearly 20 kilometers away. So it was an incredibly risky situation. And they are one of 6 First Nations in Northwestern Ontario this year that have to be evacuated.
I want to pull up an aerial photo. You can see on the top part of that photo just black. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so this is an aerial shot that Councillor David Meekus took of Deer Lake First Nation, just kind of showing some of the devastation along the way. You can only imagine flying over and seeing this as you're heading back or heading out from your community. We often think about these large stretches of Northwestern Ontario as being just wildlife and nature and forest, but there are many, many communities, well over 40 communities in this area that's about the size of France. So it's quite a scary proposition to see when you're coming in or out of your community.
Now, you spoke to Environment Canada climatologist David Phillips, not only about the number of fires, but how they're different than ever before. What did he share with you?
Mm-hmm. Well, David Phillips really wasn't mincing words when he spoke with me, Jayan. He says that the fire season starts earlier, it ends later, these fires are bigger, it's drier out, and it's impacting more people. He sent me some data going back from the 1980s to show that the 10-year average has more than doubled in terms of the total area of fires being burned. So from 1983 to 1993 to 2011 to 2021, we've seen more than a doubling of the total area that gets burned on average. So it's accelerating at a pretty rapid pace. And he's saying that in the next century, we can see these numbers double to go up tenfold, depending on various models. So this is becoming an increasing reality that as we see more area burned, we're putting more communities at risk, First Nations and otherwise, for these kinds of disasters. So they're going to become, over time more common.
Let's talk about those communities. It's not, I imagine it's not as simple as just boarding people on a plane and then sending them to, a camp or a city, but what kind of work goes into hosting communities that have to evacuate?
Right. So all levels of government are involved in this, and that includes tribal organizations and the First Nations themselves, right? Municipalities, the province, and Indigenous Services Canada are all involved in this process of the evacuations. Of course, it is more than just food. So the province will be the ones typically coordinating the province-wide effort, who goes where, asking various municipalities to host. But the host communities themselves are looking more than just a roof over people's heads and some food through 3 meals a day, right? It's mental health care, physical health care, recreational activities. These people can be here for, well over a month, right? And when you're experiencing that kind of stress, when you've been displaced, like these communities have, there's a ton that has to be done and a ton that has to be taken care of, even reunifying families, because communities get sent out in stages, right? So you might have, a mother, well, this happened in Deer Lake, who was in Cornwall or in Thunder Bay while her children were in Cornwall, which is well over 1,600 kilometers away. So you can't even imagine the stress that a lot of these people go through on a yearly basis, especially if they're doing this, multiple times over the next decade, right?
I am curious about that. Something that stuck out to me in your article for TVO.org is that the 2 cities that were chosen for this particular evacuation was in Thunder Bay and Cornwall, like you mentioned, very far from each other. How did they decide where they will go? Is this just sort of like who's available?
Yeah, it's often a question of availability. My understanding is that the city of Thunder Bay was already hosting a number of communities, and they were able to take a certain number of people in from Deer Lake, but they were just over capacity, right? Thunder Bay is just generally the natural choice, given that it's the largest city in Northwestern Ontario and has kind of the most available services. So the NAV Centre in Cornwall, which again is at the far stretch of Eastern Ontario, had about a day to prepare about 500 people. They were partly closed. They had to recall staff and accommodate these people in a very short period of time. I believe also the city of Cochrane, or the town of Cochrane rather, had a number of people as well. So people are kind of spread across the province in various stages, just based on the ability of various municipalities to hold a certain number of people.
Now, as we all know, Canadians re-elected another Liberal minority government. I'm curious, has this government in the past or now made any sort of pledge to help dealing with not only the fires, but also the evacuations?
Well, part of the Liberal government's platform this year included $500 million towards increased equipment and staffing and training for community-led firefighters. So you're looking at community-based fire groups, and even First Nations fire groups are included in that. There was also talk of implementing a national climate change adaptation strategy, which is a pretty significant thing. But climate change adaptation is a very broad kind of area of study, right? This includes everything from building raised beds on your homes to prevent flooding risks. But, everyone from Phillips to Dr. David Pearson at Laurentian University, who's working with a number of tribal organizations on climate change adaptation. He says that, evacuations are an inevitable adaptation, right? That we have to move people out as a result of climate change aggravating natural occurrences like these fires. So it's yet to be seen whether or not, evacuations and how strongly evacuations play in that larger strategy, but it's certainly something that climatologists, climate change experts, emergency management organizations, and First Nations themselves are all very concerned about as we see a growing trend of these fires and ultimately evacuations.
Something we will continue to follow. Nick, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jan.
The agenda this week debriefed the election, as well as looked for some advice on making minority parliaments work. Talked to former Minister of Justice, Jody Wilson-Raybould, about her new book, and heard why Canada's foreign policy needs updating. The agenda's week in review begins examining the problem of labor shortages in the province.
Lindsay, have you tried, for example, I don't know what, like offering a few bucks more an hour, raising the potential wages they could earn if they were to come back? You have done that.
Absolutely, yeah. We've raised the wages. Our ownership group has agreed to like match the tip out that we normally do anyways. We're out of the country kind of, so you can't take public transit here. So we've even toyed with the idea of paying for people's Ubers back and forth just to get them out here, like literally anything. We've basically exhausted every regular avenue. So,
Rebecca, how about you? Have you tried wage increases?
We have, yeah. We've increased the hourly like base pay for our staff. We've added paid sick days that weren't something that we used to do before that were typical in our industry. And I guess those are the two main things that we've done to try and encourage people and make us look more desirable. But we know that all the salons in the city are looking for staff. So it's also there's a lot of places looking.
As I welcome you two to the program, what stands out, Kaylee, among what you just heard? That's obviously a look on the ground. You see the bigger macro picture. What can you add to that?
The one thing that really stands out to me right away is just how much they talked about the uncertainty of whether or not people have transitioned to new industries or what they're doing instead. I think a lot of people have found a way to create employment and income for themselves in places where they weren't looking for it before or didn't know that they could find it. And that's one piece of this puzzle. One thing that I was really curious about, and I'd love to interrogate a little bit more, is when we're talking about job quality, what are the things that are on offer? There was an article recently from the CBC, and it was on Pizzeria Libretto that just talked directly about improving employment quality for their employers or employees and actually being able to find the workers that they needed. So in an industry like hospitality with such a high vacancy rate, that's something that seems like it would work pretty well and shows anecdotally at least that it has so far.
Interesting. Craig, how about you? What stood out?
Well, I think it really summarizes how the hard-hit industries are being affected. And it really highlights how the health risks and the risk that jobs are more precarious. In other words, worries that, the health risk is still out there. The employees are putting themselves at risk, but at the same time, they're also concerned that the job will go away again if there's new government restrictions. The one thing I'd flag, though, is I think that many people appreciate the challenges that hair salons and restaurants and other hard-hit industries, like hotels, et cetera, are experiencing labor shortages. But I would actually argue that those labor shortages are far more broad, that in point of fact, across the entire economy, many sectors, if not most sectors, are experiencing some labor shortages at the moment for a variety of different reasons.
Kaylee, do you want to follow up on your first answer? You think there may be something deeper, more systemic at play here?
Yes. I guess what I've been watching for is wondering how transitions will happen and what will transition over time in the economy as consumer demand has changed. We're looking more to people buying online versus going to stores and ordering food online versus going into a restaurant. How will that settle out in the long term is something we don't know yet, but we will know eventually. And then in terms of just thinking through broader labor shortages, I think that's something that was happening long before the pandemic hit. This is certainly not a new topic.
Now let's go back pre-pandemic. January 2020, the unemployment rate in the province of Ontario was 5.2%. In August 2021, last month, it was 7.6%. 5.2 versus 7.6. How unusual is it in an economy to have a high unemployment rate and a worker shortage at the same time?
The unemployment rate shows you that there is slack in the labor market, that there's people who are looking for jobs but can't find them. And at the same time, we have statistics from StatsCan that shows that in June, there was 815,000 vacant jobs. So we have people without jobs and we have jobs without people. And that tells you that there's a mismatch happening in the labor market.
John, why was this not a giant waste of time?
Well, because of the last word in your question, Steve, which is time. The election result, which is a healthy Liberal minority, continues the Trudeau government's time in office. And that's really important. The party was going to have to face the electorate sooner or later and seek to extend its mandate. And I think the result is positive. In evaluating whether it was a waste of time from the Liberal perspective, you'd want to ask yourself, compared to what scenario? The Liberals were very nervous about waiting a lot longer because they had rolled out pretty much everything they had to roll out in the spring 2021 budget. So if they had chosen to wait longer, sure, the pandemic would have eased off, some of the irritation level would have come down. But what would the Liberals have had to offer? More new spending? Not more money to throw around. Some dramatic new policy démarche, hard to do without more new spending. So a lot of Liberals with long memories are haunted by what happened in the late 70s when Prime Minister Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, hesitated to call an election that everyone in 1978 said, you should wait till 79. And by 1979, everyone said, oh God, you should have done it back in 78. If you don't have a strong forward offer, you're really backing yourself into a heck of a strategic corner. That's the dilemma that the Prime Minister faced in choosing to call this election. So I think he refreshed his mandate at the right time. And I think people who are talking about how disappointed the Liberals are supposed to be are not seeing the defensive aspects of why this election was called when it was, and concentrating too much on the thirst for a majority, the offensive aspects, which of course have to be factored in. So I think Trudeau got a pretty decent result out of a tricky situation, and he should be pretty happy this morning.
David, the conventional wisdom is this was a status quo election, a big nothing burger. Why would you try to convince people that something wildly exciting happened last night?
Steve, I'd like to be able to say that there was some massive upset to the status quo that makes this more talking fodder. The fact of the matter is, the Liberals banked on that there was a change in public opinion. They banked on the notion that the pandemic leadership would get them the extra seats necessary to give them a 4-year blank check, and that the pandemic had fundamentally reset a lot of the baggage that Mr. Trudeau has accumulated in the past 6 years. That bet didn't pay off. And to John's point, I think Liberals are relieved today. I mean, 3 weeks ago, they were staring at, quite frankly, an electoral defeat. Would have been one of the most catastrophic electoral calls in Canadian history. They escaped that. But they banked on this being a change, and that Trudeau could reap all kinds of plaudits for what he did last summer. And that obviously did not happen. And in fact, if anything changed, it crystallized in a lot of Canadians the reasons why that they don't have the fondness for Mr. Trudeau the way they did 6 years ago, and some of the more negative aspects of his personality and his style of leadership.
Jordan, would you attempt to convince Canadians that this was not a giant waste of time?
Well, I don't think an election is ever a waste of time, but I don't think it was a good night for Mr. Trudeau at all. The only way that this could be considered a real win for him is if we consider it in comparison to the potential scenarios that were emerging in the middle of the campaign. But at the end of the day, he went to the electorate because he wanted to seek a majority mandate. He didn't get that. And in fact, we're now back pretty much where we were before, except he's got a more challenging path ahead of him in this minority parliament. So I think that there should be a lot of soul searching on the part of Liberals about whether this was worth it. And I suspect more than a few of them wish they had a bit of a time machine to pull the plug a little earlier than they did.
Abhijit, where are you on this?
Well, I mean, I saw yesterday on Twitter somebody called it the most expensive cabinet shuffle in Canadian history. And it's, that's exactly what it was a massive waste of time, fueled mostly by hubris and ambition. And I mean, the money involved, $600 million that could have been spent, lifting how many boil water advisories, fueling and funding how many climate action projects. Not to mention, this was during a pandemic. So how many candidates, volunteers, as well as voters were exposed to COVID-19 when they didn't have to. So I think it was an incredibly ill-timed election, and I'm glad that the Canadian electorate sort of chastened the Prime Minister and gave him the same result, saying, go work with the other parties, because that's what minority governments make others do.
I have a bit of a less optimistic view, a pessimistic view. They'll surprise me if they actually pull this off and work together.
Well, let me follow up with you on that, Tonda. Presumably, much of this is helped if the Prime Minister and his most likely dance partner, in this case, I guess, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, have a decent personal relationship. Do we know if they do?
They don't. Look, Jagmeet Singh just spent 5 weeks prosecuting the case that Justin Trudeau, you couldn't trust him as far as you can throw him. They don't have a good relationship. Since last spring, Jagmeet Singh has been saying that the Liberals never do what they say they're going to do. They haven't had that kind of relationship even through pandemic. I mean, they might sort of respect each other's political skills, and I think they do. But personally, Justin Trudeau told the Star's editorial board that the way Jagmeet Singh has conducted himself in this election has contributed to the cynicism. He's terribly angry that the NDP the NDPs went out and campaigned across the country telling everybody that he'd done nothing. And he was very animated when he said, it's not nothing. We've done childcare. We have a real plan on climate change. It's not nothing. And he was actually quite angry about what he called the NDP's misleading on the record and contributing to that public cynicism writ large. So guys, no, there's not a great personal relationship. There's no bromance. They both love social media. They both have an Instagram game, but this is not, going to be a waltz. If anything, this is going to be like a, slam down, breakdown dance or something.
You're real hep with the new terms there. Go ahead, Kate.
So Hugh started this by saying it's time to put the mirror on the desk in the drawer. And I actually kind of hope we see the opposite happen. Campaigning is not governing. We all know that. There will need to be a shift now. The parties, no longer, in my view, have the same incentive around discrediting one another. They know and they've heard the message that there are a very short list of issues that matter a lot. And so, that may have been the dynamic during the campaign, but I cannot help but retain my optimism that we may see a change in the weeks to come.
Well, Hugh Segal, let me follow up with you on that, because, one of the reasons that they said that 45 years ago the minority parliaments in Ontario lasted for 6 years and worked as well as they did is that Bill Davis and the then NDP leader Stephen Lewis really got on very well and eventually developed a lifelong friendship. How significant is it in your view that the players actually like each other to make this work?
Well, let's remember that when the majority Conservative government was reduced to a minority in 75, in large measure because Mr. Lewis campaigned so effectively and said some very, very tough things about the Davis government, that did not spawn the relationship of working together in mutual respect. That developed afterwards. When Mr. Lewis was leader of the opposition, Mr. Davis was a minority premier. The Liberals had been reduced to third place, which is always happy for New Democrats and Conservatives. And on that basis, the relationship was built. So I don't disagree with Tonda's analysis at all, but I wouldn't presume that the nature of the dynamic going forward will be always limited by what it's been up until Election Day. Because all of these leaders have seen the message, they've heard it. If they have competent pollsters, it'll be explained to them. Then the issue is, what do you do now? And you can't make progress through sustained tactical animosity. It doesn't get you anywhere, and that's the choice they have to make.
Dave Cook, you want in on that?
Could I just pop in there for a sec? Let's also remember in 1977, Stephen resigned as leader. So for the largest part of minority government, Michael Cassidy was the leader of the NDP. And if I remember correctly, I don't think that Michael Cassidy and Bill Davis were best of friends. The reality in that 4 years was the NDP had a new leader. And I would say, as a member of that caucus, we were not overly optimistic of how well that leader was going to be leading us and take us into the next election. So we did not want an election. The Liberals didn't want an election. So the dynamic really was, we got to do everything we can to work as well as we can with the government and avoid an election. So it was quite a different dynamic than, say, when Stephen and Mr. Davis were there together.
Okay, here's the cabinet swearing in. I mean, that was a lovely moment of Canada swearing in its first ever Indigenous Justice Minister. What were you thinking at that moment?
Well, I mean, aside from my knees knocking together and being nervous, recognizing that the eyes of many of the eyes of the country were on me, at that moment I felt tremendous pride. I was overcome with emotion in terms of what that moment meant, of course, to me and my family, and more broadly than that, but in particular, what it meant to Indigenous peoples. Being sworn in as the first Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada that is Indigenous meant something. It meant something for the country in terms of how far we have come. So I had great hope and optimism, and a lot has transpired since that picture was taken to you and I talking. But I want to say I still have hope and I still have optimism, but it's that in between space in terms of the years and my experience within government and my experience with speaking up and speaking the truth that I sought to relay in this book in terms of lessons that I've learned, lessons around how government operates and how we can work more diligently towards improving our system of government and good governance and moving away from partisanship. So I hope that through the writing of this book and telling of my story that others can learn from that and we can continue to improve as a country.
Did you ever imagine that a few years after that quite lovely picture, you would say to that man, "I wish I'd never met you"? That's what you say in the book.
I never thought that. I mean, I do talk about some warning signs in terms of some of the interactions and experiences that I had early on, but I was overcome with a desire to do what we promised to do, to change the culture of politics, to be a government by cabinet. And, I know I wasn't the only one. In thinking back to the feeling in 2015 and the people that were around me on my campaign, so many expressed that same sense of hope and that same optimism that we can actually engage in discussions in a different way. So, talking about that line in the book where I said to Justin Trudeau that I wish I had never met him, that's how I felt in the moment. But I would not change the experience I had almost 6 years being incredibly honored to have been the Member of Parliament for Vancouver Granville, and for 3 of those years being a Minister of the Crown, an extraordinary honor by any measure. And I certainly look back on my experience and realize that everything happens for a reason. And I'm still the same person I was who decided to transition from Indigenous politics to federal politics, and getting involved, having more people from marginalized communities getting involved matters, because different voices matter. And in terms of speaking up, I will continue to do that, because we need more people to speak up, because that's how our systems improve.
Jody, everybody remembers, of course, that your relationship with the PM fell apart over SNC Lavalin. You were the Justice Minister and Attorney General at the time. You believed that he and his people were inappropriately trying to influence your independence that you felt you needed, and in fact legally you had, to do your job in the way that you did it. We don't need to relitigate the whole SNC Lavalin thing here, to be sure, but for those who don't understand the significance of what your concerns were, what exactly is the problem with a Prime Minister, a Montreal MP to boot, trying to use his good offices to try to make sure that a company that hires 9,000 people in the province of Quebec gets every break?
Well, I mean, I was the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada, and those are two very distinct roles. As the Attorney General, I am responsible, or the Attorney General is responsible for overseeing prosecutions in this country. And I understood my job very clearly. And while jobs are important and ensuring people have well-paying jobs is something that we all want to aspire to, there are basic fundamental tenets in our democracy, including having the independence of the judicial system, independence of the prosecution, and as the Attorney General, overseeing that and ensuring that there is no political interference in how one prosecutes particular cases, underscores that, and ensuring that the rule of law is upheld.
Joe Biden, the American president, said the United States has no more reliable ally in the world than Australia. I mean, Adam, he used to say that kind of stuff about us. What's going on here?
Well, it's interesting because this announcement doesn't bother me nearly as much as some of the other things that the panelists are talking about. In this case, Australia had a deal with France to buy submarines, and they didn't like it. They found a better deal with the United States, didn't seem to tell the French all that much about it. The Americans brought the British in. They signed a new pact. They added some nice words around it to make it more than just a pact. But the French took it as a stab in the back. In this case, I don't want to see Canada in the middle of a disagreement between some of its most important allies. I'm actually quite happy that we're outside of this. Not that I'm surprised that we're outside of it, but this isn't one of those things where we really want to be in the middle. We need the United States, France, Australia, the United Kingdom to get along. We can't have them fighting, and being on one side or the other doesn't get rid of this fight.
No, I appreciate that. But Lauren, this seems like a fairly significant new development, a new institution in international affairs. Most of the allies seem to have been caught off guard by the fact it happened, and we're not part of it. Is that problematic?
I mean, I would agree with Adam that, yes, it was what it was. No, it wasn't ideal from a number of reasons. But when you look at the last 2 years, it does not surprise me that you're seeing these increasingly fractured alliances. You're seeing, if we start from the start of COVID, where what we needed was international solidarity and we needed some leadership. People talk about leadership in a very ephemeral, throw the word around way. But we needed a group of people who are in charge and have been elected to make hard decisions, coming together and say, this is a frightening time. Here's what we're going to do together. Here's how we're going to get through it. And instead, we just had everybody for themselves, these very sort of tactical and self-interested trading of vaccines, for example, or short-term allegiances for domestic reasons. And you've seen that continue. You saw the G7 as well at odds and fractured, even without Trump in place. And so, no, it doesn't surprise me that 18 months after that, we're continuing to fracture, and with these short-termist alliances for domestic reasons, it's a pattern that's likely to continue, I would guess.
Gary, can I get you on that? Does it say anything of significance to the fact that we didn't know about this, we're not part of it, and yet here it is?
Well, I think I'd split the difference between Adam and Lauren. I think you can't ignore that part of this is actually about a nuclear submarine deal. There are some issues around military procurement. There's some straight business interest, dollars and cents issues around that aspect of it. You can't deny that that's absolutely part of it. But the other side of it too is this area around information sharing. And for a long time, there's been accusations that Canada hasn't been doing this part. I read a recent piece by Stephanie Carvin, who talked about Canada's involvement in the Five Eyes community, which is the three countries we've talked about, plus Canada and New Zealand. And for a long time, Australia has been playing a much more leading role in information sharing and active role in the Five Eyes, maybe than Canada has been. And that requires investment and taking part in it. I think what is more concerning from an ally standpoint, and hearing Biden's comments, is that increasingly there are a number of regional forums around the world, whether it's the Quad, whether it's other forums, where Canada has remained disinterested. And my former colleague, Howard Anglin, who was Deputy Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Harper and worked a lot on foreign policy issues as well, said, as Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau has shown little interest in strategic defense or geopolitics. That means that Canada's foreign policy has largely been left to the gray men and women of the Pearson Building. The problem with this approach is that you stop showing up for your friends, eventually they stop inviting you. And I think that are some wise words that are worth considering when we talk about this new alliance.
Bess, I see you nodding your head. You think we're just not worth inviting to these parties anymore?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, what are we bringing to the table, frankly? And I really don't think this is just about nuclear-powered subs. What's on the table here is really fundamental. It's about emerging technologies. We're talking about artificial intelligence. We're talking about quantum, cybersecurity, even industrial policy, talking about supply chains. I mean, this is a very comprehensive pact. And I think the fact that we're excluded says a lot. And frankly, this is not a time when we should be not just only excluded, but, sort of shortchanging our own investment in these issues. This is the wave of the future. It is like investing in the internet, 25 years ago, thinking, it's okay if other people do it, we don't have to do it. It's not that way. We need to put more into this. So I think the emerging technology piece is key. This is where we need to put more money in it. And the fact that we are excluded, I think says something about the fact that, Canada doesn't bring a lot to the table.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, September 24th, 2021. Monday, we'll find out why climate scientists are keeping a close watch on the stability of the Gulf Stream and how its collapse would be a global tipping point. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve, we'll see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.